IVM.
For millennia altogether, relations between India and Europe have flourished, and they've shaped each other's history. Indian colonies fed the Industrial Revolution, and European imperialism introduced India into the modern state system. In more recent times, India's relations with the European Union are important, but are easily overlooked in our strategic calculus, which focuses on Pakistan, China, or the United States. Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. I am your host, Hamsini Hariharan. Every week on the show, I talk to experts about international relations, all in the hope of making a little more sense of the world. Here are some statistics about the EU-India relationship. The European Union is India's largest trading partner, accounting for 80 billion euros worth of trade and goods in 2019, or 11.1% of total Indian trade, on par with the USA and ahead of China. The EU's share in foreign investment in India doubled from 8% to 18% in the last decade, making the EU the foremost foreign investor in India. Some 6,000 European companies are present in India, providing directly 1.7 million jobs and indirectly 5 million jobs in a broad range of sectors. Indian companies have invested over 50 billion euros in Europe since 2000. Now, as you mull these numbers, ask yourself this. Why did relations between India and EU reach a low point? How does India compare with other countries in Asia as a partner for the EU? And what can we look forward to in the relations between the two blocs, considering Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic? My guest for today is one of the best voices working on relations between India and Europe. Dr. Garima Mohan is a fellow in the Asian program of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where she heads work on India and heads the India Trilateral Forum. Garima researches on India-Europe ties, EU foreign policy on Asia, and security in the Indo-Pacific. She's consulted with policymakers, published extensively academically and in the public space. We'll get back to the conversation with Garima after a short break when we hear from IBM Podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. Some really fun guests on the network this week. Cyrus welcomed Dia Mirza to come and have a conversation about all kinds of different things. Danny Morrison was on Edges and Sledges, the cricket podcast. If you haven't heard that, that's always a fun listen. And Raul Subramanian was on Football Should Ball to grow their ever more exciting list of guests. And it's not just that. Mantra Mugdha, old friend of ours, was on Advertising is Dead. Manu Pillai was on the Filter Coffee podcast. It's been one great guest after the other. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Hi, Garima. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So whenever, over the last couple of months, I've realized that when we talk about Indian foreign policy, we've started to talk a lot about China and the US and Japan even, but we don't talk a lot about Europe anymore. And I found it extremely strange because the EU is India's largest trading partner. So take us a little back in history. How did this relationship evolve?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When we talk of India's foreign policy and India's partnerships, somehow the EU in particular, not just, I would say other European countries like France are still considered very important partners, but the European Union in particular is always at the bottom of the list, which I find quite interesting because as you mentioned, the EU is India's largest trading partner and the EU does trade together as a bloc. So all the countries are taken together. So given that, I mean, their numbers are quite high. They are at par with the US and they are actually ahead of China when it comes to India's trade partnerships. 2019, we did more trade with them than we did with China. The EU is also the second largest destination for Indian exports. Within the EU, it is Germany that is the largest sort of importer and exporter, towards Indian goods. So given that economically and for the health of the economy, the EU is such an important trade partner, I find it interesting how it has been sort of relegated to a second standard in Indian foreign policy. And it wasn't like that in the beginning. So Let me take you to a quick history lesson. When the European Economic Community, the EEC, was created in 1957. So this is sort of a precursor to modern day EU, where six major countries, France, Italy, West Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg came together and said, okay, let's, create a common market and let's do all of our trade together. So even back then, India understood the importance of this, and we were actually very skeptical. We were afraid of how this would impact our markets and our relationship with Europe, which, because of colonial ties, was still a pretty important destination. So Nehru at that time was one of the first people to recognize. We opened an embassy already in 1962. Our first ambassador to the EU in Brussels, Ambassador Lal, was a very sort of activist figure. And it's interesting if you look at, modern day parallels. When the EEC was negotiating with the UK, whether UK should join them or not, India was one of the key players in this entire argument because we did not want UK to join this market because we thought that would hamper the access of Indian goods and services to UK, which was very important for us. So when the UK decided to, when they were negotiating their position with the EEC, we got a clause inserted into that agreement that if the UK joins, we will be the first country to have a FTA with the newly created EEC. So, flash forward, UK didn't end up joining, sort of similar to what's happening with Brexit today. And look at the EU-India relationship now. There's still no FTA, even though back in the day, we were the first ones to say, we want a trading partnership with you. So in the beginning, we were very interested to see, how is this new animal going to behave? What does it mean for sort of how Europe acts, as a player in international relations? We were very keen to see how this goes, and we didn't want to miss any opportunities. And since then, there's sort of been, ebbs and flows in the relationship, depending on personalities of leaders on both sides. But here we are today, where we've gone through, a particularly dark period where there were no summits, we weren't even talking to each other, to the relationship as it is now, which I would say is at an all-time high. But even that, it's not given the same importance as some of India's other partnerships.
Yeah, and I find that very, very interesting because the EU actually, if you look at sort of Indian trade and Indian market presence, is very active. You have a lot of companies that invest in India that have set up, manufacturing units. Products from the European Union are widely available here. You have a lot of soft power initiatives that are going on. You have a lot of students who go to Europe and study there and return. So it's very interesting that this relationship is not on more of a forefront, and you don't have more active lobbying for the EU to sort of become a pillar of Indian foreign policy.
Yeah, I think that's also because how India looks at, economics. We are more interested in building up our defense capabilities and security. Sort of, we talk a lot about hard power. Think tanks in India, the strategic community is more interested in those questions and less so in trade and economics. We've had a really checkered history with free trade agreements, for example. India's not really concluded a lot of free trade agreements. It's very difficult for us to do so. So economics and trade has sort of been secondary. The main question for us has always been more existential, right? Like with the conflict with China now and how we are situated. So I do see that there is much more focus on that aspect and less on the trade and economics part, but which is also changing. Now we are discovering that economic security is also important. Look at the recent ban on Chinese apps, the whole conversation about Huawei. We are understanding that the companies that we work with and the economic partners that we have will also have an impact on our security. So I see that, that the conversation is moving in the right direction.
All right. So what do you think are sort of the main components or the pillars of relations between the two blocs?
Yeah. So I would say there are three main pillars of the EU-India relationship. The first most important is trade, as I had mentioned, economics. The second is, I would say, political, and that has evolved over time. So the EU, when it was created, it was largely created as a common market, and it's only over time that it acquired other capabilities, particularly having a common foreign and defense and security policy. It's very recent. The 2007 Lisbon Treaty gave much more powers to Brussels and the EU as compared to the member states. So as the EU has evolved, our relationship with it has evolved as well. So I would say the second most important pillar is the political partnership. And interestingly, this pillar is moving much better than the trade and economics pillar because the FTA is stuck. And the third most important pillar is EU's role in India's growth story and modernization. And I think that is a very important part of the relationship because the EU and its member states are key players when it comes to the Indian government schemes like smart cities, Clean Ganga initiative, building infrastructure, improving domestic connectivity, railway grids, civil aviation, also to deal with climate change, adaptation projects. That's where you find the EU doing a lot. And again, this is something that is not considered important by our foreign policy establishment. But I think that is, not a good approach because we need to build domestic resilience. A lot of the promise of India as a partner in foreign policy lies on the fact that our partners want us to be able to pull our weight in the region, right? They want us to be an important pillar of stability in Asia overall, and we cannot be a leading power if we don't have our house in order. So this domestic resilience, modernization, I think that is a very important part of the EU-India partnership. But again, because it's not sexy, it's not how many fighter jets are you buying or how many naval exercises you're doing. It's sort of relegated again to a corner somewhere, but it's actually working rather well.
Yeah, I think, when you talk about a lot of the things that you mentioned, including like climate change and a lot of the economic activities that happen, they're relegated to sort of one step above cultural diplomacy, right? Because they're not, like you said, sexy. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to sort of political partnerships, the second important pillar that you spoke about, the EU is often pointed out as an institution that's very formal, that has a lot of procedures, that has a lot of bureaucracy that steps through. And I can't help but think that that's very similar to how Indian policy making and Indian bureaucracy also functions. So do you think that this has sort of been an element in just them being able to conduct dialogue?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And in fact, I think I might use it later on as well because I think that's the problem that both sides are these labyrinthian bureaucracies which love to, issue long documents and institute dialogues, and very little happens then, because you need at least one partner to have a bit more momentum. But often on both the side of the EU and India, we see dialogues. And if you look at our summits, right, the joint statements that come out of the summits, most of them are, in fact, let's create this dialogue here, let's create that mechanism there. But very little then actually happens on the ground. So it is true. And it's not just with India, it's also with EU's other strategic partners, including South Korea, Japan, other countries where they also have, similar issues that people don't know who's in the driving seat. There are many institutions, many sort of buildings within the EU and different people with long titles. And it's difficult to understand, who's doing what. It's difficult to be like, who is the one person we can talk to? And this is why I think the EU-India partnership has been driven mostly by personalities. So again, looking back to when we signed a strategic partnership agreement with them in the 2000s, it was Javier Solana who was really driving the EU to take India seriously as a partner. But then at the same time, the Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi, he actually contributed to relations dipping down because he was supposed to come to India for a EU-India summit. He went to the airport and there decided he's not coming. He's not getting on the plane. And back then Italy had the presidency, and so he was supposed to represent the EU. So, these personalities have often either helped take the relationship forward or really tripped things. Similarly, on the Indian side, we saw a lot of momentum under Narasimha Rao with the liberalization of the economy, where they understood that Europe is important. Under Vajpayee, where they saw that, no, we need to, engage more. If we want a global standing for India, we need to work with the EU as well. But then under Manmohan Singh, we saw, the US nuclear deal getting more importance, the relationship with France getting on the front seat, and the EU falling back. So it's very interesting when you chart out the history, you see these ebbs and flows, and they're often related to personalities rather than the dialogue and the relationship itself.
Yeah, and I think that's because, these bureaucracies also have to handle multiple things, right? And they're often besieged under the amount of work that they're doing. So maybe they need sort of that extra push and initiative. And that's a pity, but perhaps that's just the way the structure of the bureaucracy itself is on both sides.
Yeah, and I mean the Indian bureaucracy within the MEA, we have one division that takes care of Europe West that includes bilateral partnerships with Western European countries plus the EU. So, that's a lot to put on somebody's desk, like one person or one small division's desk, that you also deal with the bilaterals, but then you also deal with this big institution, which is, very difficult to understand and is a big multilateral institution. Yeah, so I think there is that too. And I hope that someday, because we've been seeing recently the Ministry of External Affairs in India has seen a few reforms and, creation of new divisions and innovations within the organization. My hope is that one day we'll also see the importance of Europe and then maybe reorganize how we deal with the different European countries. Because right now it's sort of based in this very Cold War division of East and West Europe, and the EU sort of put in with Western Europe.
Okay, and this is something that I've actually been wondering about. How does India manage its bilateral relations with several of these countries and also its relationship with the EU? Because we do have pretty strong relations with France, with Germany, and so how does that work?
Yeah, I think our bilateral relationships work much better because it's easy for India also to work with individual countries because it's a smaller bureaucracy than the EU. So our relationship with France has become one of the most important strategic partnerships that India has globally. With Germany, our relationship is mostly predicated on trade and economics, but it's still going well. Particularly with Brexit, India understood that it needs to invest more in the partnerships with other European countries. So under the first Modi government iteration, we saw several trips to Europe, and then subsequently we've seen the Prime Minister having a summit with the Nordic countries, with Spain and Portugal, meetings to Spain and Portugal, to several visits to Germany. The EAM has been going to, the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has been going to Eastern European countries a lot. We saw he was in Hungary and other places. So we've just realized that we cannot let these individual partnerships, lose momentum. But it's what I want to actually talk about is one point I want to make here is sometimes we see the member states as very separate from the EU. We forget that it's actually the EU is made of its member states. So the people who are sitting in Brussels are sent from these individual countries. So we do not leverage our bilateral partnerships enough at the EU level. Because there's some things that we want from the EU where our partnership with France, for example, can help, or our partnership with Germany can help because of the weight Germany and France have within the EU and in Brussels. So it's a complicated game, and I don't think we have figured it out well. A few countries have. I see the Japanese have learned it very well. They know how to leverage bilateral relationships at the Brussels level. But then we need to have a clear understanding of what we want the EU to deliver for us. sometimes which I don't see happening. I see a lot of Indians saying, what does the EU bring for us? They only care about China. And, what do they bring to us? They need to come to us as an important partner. But I often wonder the goal of foreign policy is what we want from our partners, right? So we need to have a conversation internally. Where do we see the EU as an important partner? Where are the gaps in our external capabilities and domestic capabilities where the EU can be an important partner? And if it can, then we sort of work on those things. And if it cannot, then, let's invest less in this relationship and work more with our bilateral partners.
And do you think, because you brought up China, do you think there is sort of a more cognizance of just the importance that China is sort of taking on the world stage within the EU, and how are they sort of going about it? Because you hear about, this transcontinental railway that's stretching all the way to sort of Poland, and a lot about like how the One Belt, One Road activities are now going towards the EU. So just because we're on China, I want to know your thoughts about it.
Yeah, so I think China is a very important factor both within the EU and in the EU-India partnership. I think one of the reasons why this summit this year in 2020 was important is because of China. Finally, Europe and India have common goals, and most of them directly or indirectly concern China. So going to your question, how is China seen in Europe? China has now become a topic of domestic politics in Europe, which is a very interesting development. For us, they are an important topic in our domestic politics because we share a boundary with them. They're our neighbor, there's geographical proximity. That's not the case in Europe. But China has been increasing its presence in Europe through several factors. One is the Belt and Road Initiative. As you mentioned, there is the railway lines and investments within different European countries, but also in Europe's neighborhood, investing in strategic projects, so critical infrastructure like ports, railways, telecom, all of which have security implications, right? So Europe started waking up to this when they saw that in some of the countries in Europe's neighborhood, which had difficult domestic politics or, authoritarian governments, they were being attracted more and more towards China. And then even within Europe, countries like Greece, Hungary, Italy, Portugal, actually getting more and more money and investments from China, and then voting within the EU on things in China's favor. So voting, saying that the EU doesn't need to pass a resolution on the South China Sea and stuff like that. So when this investment started having an impact on how Europe sort of politically, what is happening in Europe, and had an impact on sort of Europe's own integrity, that's when people started waking up to China. And now, you open the newspaper in any country, in France, in Germany, in Brussels, and you have big articles on Chinese companies and how they're taking over and how they have an unfair advantage because they have subsidies, and what China is doing in Hong Kong and Taiwan. These things get a lot of media coverage, but also the question of disinformation that came around the coronavirus crisis. So China got medical supplies from Europe when they had their coronavirus problems before anybody else. And they told Europeans to keep it hush-hush. They said, keep it on the down low that you're giving us aid. And then when Europe became the epicenter and all these, then China sort of went on overdrive, sending masks and making a whole show of sending medical equipment. And at the same time, sort of underlining that Europe is doing a bad job. We've won the war against the virus and now we are helping you. So I think that did not go down well. And several politicians across Europe started talking about it. 5G is a topic where a lot of European countries are now trying to ban Huawei, and you see parliamentary hearings on it. So as I was saying, it's become a domestic politics topic. Lay people in Europe would have an opinion on China when you talk to them. And I think that's a big change from how things were maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating because, as you said, China is not sort of a geographical threat And I remember reading a lot about how like the Prague city mayor had like very strong opinions about China,
Yeah.
and it got me wondering to why those came about. And would it be fair of me to say that, since the 2008 economic crisis particularly, sort of the cleavages within the EU as to, which countries are more developed, which countries are less developed, have
Mhm.
begun showing up more within the EU itself. And that sort of now plays out with China and other external partners as well.
I mean, you're right in the sense that the cleavages within Europe are showing more since the financial crisis. And I would actually add to that and say these cleavages are not just on economics, they're also political. When you see more authoritarian bend of governments in Hungary, more conservative right-leaning governments in Poland, you also see, differences within political systems, within values showing up within Europe, which I think is also part of the rise of populism that is linked to the economic crises in different countries within Europe. So I think that's an interesting observation. I would be careful in linking that to China because Chinese investments, everybody talks about the 16 plus 1, 17 plus 1 initiative, which was largely Central and Eastern European countries and China. But when you look at the absolute numbers, the largest investments and trade partnerships of China are with the bigger European countries like France, Germany, and the UK. So while these cleavages are important to understand, I think sometimes they can be a bit overstated, particularly with the relationship with China. I would say all European countries have enjoyed and have taken advantage of the opportunities of investment and trade that come from China, whether they are small or whether they're big. But I do think that it's the bigger countries that now have to make a harder decision because market access to China is reducing. Chinese companies are sort of taking over some of the bigger main players from Germany, France, which is a question for them. So a lot of soul searching all around is going on in Europe.
Getting back to India, you'd mentioned earlier as well that relations between EU and India had reached a low point when our free trade agreement wasn't sort of reached in 2015. Can you tell us why things were on the low and how they've improved, if they've improved?
Yeah, definitely. They have certainly improved. So the low period in the EU-India relationship, I would say, started around 2012 and continued for about 4 years when we did not even have our annual summits. So before that, we were having summits, either annually or biannually. We would find time to meet, but this was a low period when we did not meet at all. There was, no conversations, and people see that as a low point. And the FTA not being negotiated was one reason, but I think there were several other reasons as well. So I think 2012 is quite close to the sovereign debt crisis, the financial crisis that happened in 2008. So Europe was quite, involved in internal matters, trying to get the economy back on track. There was a lot going on in Europe's neighborhood as well. Remember, Libya happened at that time, and that is, the Mediterranean crisis, the refugee crisis, the first wave that started way back. Then the whole sort of European attention was focused very much on their near neighborhoods. And in India, also, there was a sense that, our relationship with the US was getting closer. We had other priorities. And Europe was getting a lot of negative press because of the financial crises as well, on questions like responsibility to protect. In Libya, we were sort of clashing. There was a feeling that Europe doesn't quite have its foreign policy together. And then the Italian Marines were arrested in the state of Kerala, which led to further problems because a former Italian politician then became the EU's top diplomat, the High Representative, that position is called, and they are the main diplomat that represent EU outside. So there were several factors, I think, that contributed to this lull in the relationship. And it started getting back on track after 2016 when the two countries decided, okay, now we have, we've overcome a lot of these issues, and we need to talk about important things where I think on the EU side, there was a beginning of a recognition that the partnership with China is going to be problematic and is going to continue like that. So we need to diversify and we need to invest in other partners in Asia, of which India is the most important. So I think from that time, you start to see the summits get back on track, the conversations happen much more. I have to say the EU delegation in Delhi did a great job because they started talking about all the things that people in Delhi want to hear about, the strategic community in Delhi want to hear about. For example, maritime security in the Indian Ocean. For example, counterterrorism, elevating the partnership and saying we have common sort of overlapping neighborhoods that come in the Middle East, Indian Ocean area. We should be doing more there. We should be working more with third partners in Africa. We should be talking about, peacekeeping, all of these operations. We need to be talking about anti-piracy operations. We need to talk to India about global data and tech regimes because India is going to be an important player there. So I would say from the EU side, there was a recognition that on several fronts, whether it is climate, whether it is data, whether it is trade, whether it's security, India is going to be an important partner for them and they need to quickly repair this relationship.
It's very interesting for me that they think that India is a big partner because, other countries in Asia like Vietnam, like countries within the ASEAN itself are also sort of projecting themselves as sort of important players during this time. And what do you think is sort of the difference in the relationship that the EU has with India versus other countries in Asia?
That's a very interesting question. You're right. I think India is one of the more important players, and the other ones, I would say the EU has a long-standing relationship with ASEAN, particularly because ASEAN was also, a regional bloc like the EU, and in the heyday, both partners wanted to really talk to each other and learn lessons on integration. Japan is also an important partner. The EU is trying to negotiate. It has, in fact, negotiated free trade agreements with Japan, with Vietnam, with Singapore, and now they're trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with ASEAN as a whole. So absolutely you're right that in terms of trade and economics, these partnerships are important, and I think they should be seen in an attempt from the European side to diversify its partnerships with different players in Asia, because before they sort of put all of their eggs in the China basket and then they realize that this will not fly and they need to have a plan B. And I think this is why they're also trying really hard to negotiate the FTA with India. So the difference between the relationship with India and say EU's partnerships with ASEAN or Japan is the sheer weight that India brings, the size of the economy, the prospects of, having a young population, the size of our population, the big market that it represents, but also the weight that India has on international institutions, the diplomatic weight that India has overall. I think that is qualitatively a different partnership and they really want to build on that.
That's very interesting for me because whenever I look at, India's sort of diplomatic stances, India and EU have often found themselves on the opposite sides of global debates because, India is a country that has asserted itself as a developing power, and it often says that, it can't concede on some issues like climate change or trade negotiations like other countries can. So how do their interactions on multilateral forums sort of affect their relations with each other?
So I would say in the beginning, in the earlier part of the relationship, this was more prominent. Both India and Europe talk about the importance of multilateralism, but we mean different things. So Europe wants to maintain all the institutions like the UN, Security Council, WTO, etc., because Europe had a hand in creating these institutions. Whereas when India talks about multilateralism, we talk about reformed multilateralism because we want these institutions to become more representative and up to date with changes in the world order. So clearly in the beginning, there were lots of differences of opinion which remain to this day, but particularly we have found things to talk about. For example, on climate, at the time of the Paris Treaty, with the US withdrawing, India did not step back. India stepped up, in fact. So when we have our renewable energy targets within the country, overall, we are much more amenable to talking about climate change. We do, when it comes to actually sitting down and implementing things and putting things on paper, we do have different opinions, but our positions have come much closer than they had before. I think now, as the world stands, the more important thing and the way multilateralism will move forward is by creating these sort of issue-based coalitions or value-based coalitions of partnerships of different countries. The Quad is one example, but we also have other bilateral, trilateral, minilateral partnerships with Australia, with Japan, with Indonesia, with New Zealand. The EU is also looking at something like this. So there is a talk of a parliamentary alliance of countries when it comes to dealing with China, working in different constellations, working a coalition of democracies. Germany has this idea of alliance of multilateralism where India is a member. EM Jaishankar recently gave an interesting speech there, and I would suggest people to look at it because it shows how India is willing to engage with these forums. And also, I think on the Indian side, we've realized, particularly with the rise of China, we've realized that institutions, norms, and rules are important. And we need to have a stake in these international institutions, whether we like it or not. And I think this third most important thing is, with the creation of formats like BRICS, etc., at that point, the antagonism and the differences in positions between, say, Europe and India was much sharper because we still had this idea of Asian or anti-Western solidarity, right? Like we would work with China, we would work with Russia, Brazil, South Africa. Look at how things have changed now. In fact, now we are looking for different kinds of partners when it comes to managing the China challenge. So the shifts within the world, the divisions within the world between the East and the West and global North and global South, I think they're shifting and new allegiances, new coalitions are coming up, which create more opportunities for, say, India to work with Europe.
And this is something that you mentioned briefly before. We spoke about Brexit, and we'd also spoken a little bit about how you have this wave of more nationalistic forces that are taking part within domestic politics, not only within India and within some countries of Latin America, but all over the world, including countries in the EU. So how do you think the EU as an organization is sort of dealing with a lot of these factors?
I think like governments around the world, dealing with populism is the next challenge. And I think it's a big challenge, and I don't think countries have figured out the right way to do it. And in the recent EU Parliament elections, there was a surge of populist parties, even in the Brussels level. Within the member states, we see a surge of populist parties. And at times, the EU's responses are criticized as not sharp enough when it comes to dealing with Orban in Hungary, or what's happening currently in Poland with a conservative government, rollback of rights in certain other parts of European countries. So I think there's a lot of introspection happening. There are a lot of conversations happening around this. Rather than the EU, the conversation needs to happen in individual member states because parties are linked to people. And the whole criticism around the EU and Brexit also stemmed from the fact that this government in Brussels was seen as too far away, and people wanted more rights and more powers and less globalization, and the EU in the sense was a victim of that. But after Brexit, we've seen a sharp wave of support for the EU coming from the center and the left in a number of European countries, where people do understand the importance of the European project and they want to strengthen the EU. So you see a lot of movements and counter movements happening in Europe. And it is, of course, a concern for Europeans what's happening in other parts of the world when it comes to populist governments, but there is much more, sort of the tone is very tempered. Like back in the day, Europe could lecture people about human rights, about democracy. In fact, they portrayed Europe and they said, oh yes, we are a normative power. We are, a regulatory superpower and we are a normative power without really, I found that interesting. For a continent with a history of colonialism to say we are a normative power and we are a civilizational power, it sort of rubbed me the wrong way always. So in a way, I'm glad the discourse is moving away from that. And the discourse now is that all over the world, countries are facing waves of populism, anti-globalization. We need to have a conversation about where we're failing, where our governments are failing in providing safety nets, in providing welfare, in addressing legitimate economic criticisms and concerns of some of our populations, but also really clamping down and having an honest conversation about questions like racism and general xenophobia. So I think that's an interesting development, and here the developments we see in the US, in Europe, in our subcontinent, elsewhere in the world, we are sort of on the same wavelength.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think a couple of things come up for me. And one of them is, yeah, I completely agree with you. When Europe would sort of talk about itself as being a normative power, it was something that sort of got to me in a way that I couldn't really enunciate as well. And I was just thinking about how recently with the Indian government abrogating Article 370, there was a group of, these far-right ministers from all over the EU who visited Kashmir. And the visit did backfire a little bit, and it got a lot of flack from people in India as well as abroad. And it just strikes me that we haven't really found answers, any of us, to problems of populism and nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, let's just say that visit was a PR disaster on several levels, and it sort of backfired everywhere. Criticism in India, criticism in Europe. Yes, so yeah, I do want to talk about one thing, that a question I always get on Twitter whenever I talk about the Europe-India partnership. People say things like, oh, well, they always bring up human rights and they brought up the question of Kashmir or the CAA, and the European Parliament brings it up. I think there is less understanding that the European Parliament is a group of political parties and representatives who legitimately ask questions. And it's not just this partnership, it's also India's other partnerships where these questions have been raised. And the Indian government has spent a lot of time in actually addressing these questions and allaying these concerns. So I think it's legitimate when partners have these concerns, but at the same time, we must not over exaggerate one resolution passed in the parliament, because it doesn't really impact the executive, the European Commission and other institutions that are actually dealing with India and taking all the decisions. So these are different institutions, but I do feel like the Indian government has also tried to has spent a lot of time sort of addressing these concerns abroad, not just for the Europeans, but also for Americans and other partnerships. So these are legitimate questions that come up with all of our partners. I think the difference is now that the EU is just much more amenable to understanding and having a dialogue rather than having a position of lecturing and sanctions and all of that.
Yeah, and I wonder also, if it just comes to the EU's soul searching of itself, whether it now doesn't have as much of an external threat anymore, in the sense that the memories of the war are long gone. I mean, they still exist, and of course, no one forgets history, but you have generations that have grown up without the active threat of the Cold War on their borders. And it makes me wonder if that's one of the reasons that the EU is also sort of soul searching for ways in which that they can take their partnerships ahead.
That's an interesting question. I would say the current debate in Europe is much more about the romance of the transatlantic partnership fading away, and the US-Europe relationship actually becoming very tenuous and very problematic. That is forcing Europeans to say, we need to wake up and we need to find our own course. So for a long time, European foreign policy was under the umbrella, they have the security umbrella of the NATO and the US, and the US is taking all the decisions, and they were sort of, the transatlantic partnership was central for them, Asia and the rest of the world less so. But now with the security guarantees under question, Trump keeps making statements about NATO and withdrawing troops from Germany and all of that. There is now a question that, okay, we need to rethink or have a new conversation about European security, about European strategic autonomy. Are we simply following the lead of the US, or do we need to have our own policy when it comes to partnerships in Asia, global security in general, and institutions in the world where, with the WHO, the US withdrawing from the World Health Organization, Europe had to step in. And so there are now these vacuums being created where European policymakers will have to step up. I remember having this conversation with a German policymaker after Trump was elected who said, well, finally, this gives us an opportunity to have our own policy towards Asia and have a rethink about how we interact with the rest of the world. So I think that conversation is more important right now for a lot of younger Europeans. The image of the US, the current US president, opinion polls show that they are at an all-time low. And let's see if this changes, if with a Biden administration, maybe this changes a little bit, but I do think that Europeans are talking much more about strategic autonomy, about finding their own course and charting their own path, whether it comes to China, whether it comes to global institutions, whether it comes to the rest of Asia. So I think that's also a part of why there is a soul searching and more of an effort to have a broader ranging conversation about foreign policy.
Yeah, and I think you're right. With elections, things might change, but there's also, a group of scholars who believe that whatever policies that have been put in place by the Trump administration may be carried forward by realists within the American system as well. And so, I'm someone who says, okay, maybe we also need to think about India's foreign policy and see if the choices that we're making are the ones that are the best for India's national interests. And so I completely get why young European policymakers would also be thinking of the same thing. Against this and the pandemic, what do you sort of think is the way forward for relations between India and EU? What do you think the relations should be like in the future as well?
So the EU has a new commission, newly elected set of leaders that took position beginning of this year, end of December, January. We saw a new cohort come in Brussels, and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she had outlined in her priorities that she wants this to be a geopolitical commission. She wants Europe to take a geopolitical role. And that was sort of sidelined because of the pandemic. And of course, now domestic concerns are more important again. Foreign policy has sort of become secondary while countries deal with the coronavirus response. But I think going forward for Europe and India, as with other relationships, I think the China question will be quite important. The US question will be quite important too. So China, because as Europe's relationship with China becomes more and more tensed and the relations are becoming more and more difficult to manage, there will be an impetus and a big lobby within Europe to strengthen the partnership with India. Similarly, for India to understand that in order to develop both its domestic and external capacities, it needs to be working with Brussels, and Europe can be an important partner when it comes to, technology, connectivity, infrastructure. We have to deliver to our neighbors because we are sort of losing ground in South Asia. And as we need to deliver to our neighbors, here also Europe can be an important partner. It can be an important partner in the Indian Ocean. As we discover new avenues, I think this is going to drive the partnership forward. The trade aspect after coronavirus, A lot of countries are taking more protectionist approaches, but with the economic downturn, we'll have to really rethink trade, and maybe that leads to a movement in the free trade agreement, because both Europe and India will have to move the red lines that they have drawn, because it's a whole new situation. We are living in a whole new world. And then I think lastly, the US factor. So in Indian foreign policy and in European foreign policy, there's a recognition of uncertainty of US engagement, which might continue under new administration in a different way. If Biden's priorities are building domestic capacities, the US will again focus less on the outside world, right? Which leaves both Europe and India to sort of fend for themselves. And that might also drive the relationship forward. But I think I would only caution that becoming too focused on the domestic, that is the only way this partnership can lose momentum. Otherwise, I see a pretty good, solid track record set by this summit and a solid trajectory of relations going forward.
Awesome. Okay, Garima, this is my last question for you. And this is something that I ask all of my guests. What books or what resources would you recommend for anyone who wants to read more about relations between India and the EU or learn more about the subject?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For students, I would recommend looking at the websites of the MEA in India and the European External Action Service. It's called EEAS. They have abundance of resources, maps, statistics. Really, that helps you demystify this relationship and go beyond the rhetoric to make your own judgments, whether you think that this is an important partner for India or not, and vice versa. Then there are a few authors like Thierry Tardy, Christophe Jaffrelot, who have written a lot about Europe as a security actor, Europe-India relationship, how does Europe see India, which are quite interesting. And then we had a former Indian ambassador, Bhaswati Mukherjee, who wrote a book on India and EU, An Insider's View, which is also interesting because it sort of tells you the Indian perspective, because she worked on this, particularly the EU portfolio, for a long time. And that's an interesting window into, what I was mentioning earlier about different summits and why did they work, why did they not, what was happening in India at that time, what was happening in Europe. So I'd say those are a few. And then, of course, any foreign policy tome you pick up by former ambassadors, former foreign secretaries. There's always a chapter on Europe. It's always short, but it's interesting to locate Europe in India's strategic thinking. I would plug my book, but I'm still unfortunately working on it. Hopefully, I'll be done by next year.
Yes, hopefully whenever you're done, you can come back and talk to us about it.
That would be lovely.
Thank you, Garima. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Garima's recommendations are in the episode description as usual, so do go and check those out. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter or at States of Anarchy on Instagram. And every Friday, we organize a mini quiz on our Instagram page. So come and test your knowledge of the world. States of Anarchy is supported by the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, IPSMF. And we are super grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to you, dear listener, for tuning in week after week. If you want to help us reach more people, please leave us a rating on iTunes so that more people can discover us. You can listen to States of Anarchy, not only on the IBM Podcast app, but whatever you're using right now to listen to me. We'll be back on the 18th of August.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्ताने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!